Hi guys, welcome back. In this lecture we are going to discuss types of exceptions in C#. In the last lecture we have seen what is exceptions. Exception is a kind of issue that is raised when a particular statement in a C# program is executed. We have seen one example, the format exception. If you input a string, when the program expects a number, it will result in format exception. So in this lecture, we will see few types of exceptions that is normally encountered in a C# program execution. Now, all exceptions in C# are represented by classes. And the exceptions in C# are derived from the system.exception class. We will understand and learn what is class and objects in a future lecture. But for the time being, understand that all exceptions in C# is represented by a class, or it is derived from a class, and the base class is system.exception. Let's see few types of exceptions now. The first one, system.format exception. We have discussed this. When it is generated or thrown. Normally the word used to represent the generation of exception in a programming terminology is thrown. Exception is thrown. So the system.format exception is thrown when the format of an argument or data is invalid. That is, if you supply a different type of data than the expected type, then this kind of exception is thrown. The next one is divide by zero exception. It is thrown when you try to divide a number by 0. You know that mathematically it is not possible to divide a number by 0. So in a program, if you try to divide a number by 0, the divide by 0 exception occurs. The next one is index out of range exception. This exception is thrown when an array index is out of range. For example, consider that you have declared and initialized an array of the size 5. And you know that the index will vary from 0 to 4 in that case. But if you try to refer the index 5, it will result in the exception index out of range exception, because the index 5 is not a valid index with an array of size 5. Next one is out of memory exception. It is thrown if there is insufficient free memory. Next one is null reference exception. This exception is raised when you refer a null object. We will discuss these kind of exceptions in detail when we learn object-oriented programming. Next is IO exception. This has the base of system.io.io exception, input-output exception. This exception is thrown when an IO error occurs, input-output error occurs. These kind of errors normally occurs when you read or write file from a device. We will be discussing these kind of exceptions when we learn file handling in C#. Next one is overflow exception. This exception is thrown when a number becomes too large to be represented. For example, if you try to store a very large number into a byte type variable, this kind of exception can occur because a byte type variable cannot store very large numbers. We have its range available, so we can store only values within that range. If you try to input a value which is not within that range, then overflow exception occurs. Now let's look into how we can handle exceptions that occurs in a C# program. Exceptions in a C# program can be handled using the TryCatch block. Let's see what for the TryCatch block is used and how it can be used. TryCatch block is used to catch and handle exceptions. In the try block, the statements that may throw an exception are coded. Now, immediately after the try block, we have the catch block. In the catch block, the statements that should be executed if an exception is thrown by any statement inside the try block are coded. So, from the try block, a statement can result into an exception. If an exception occurs, that exception is thrown. The thrown exception is caught in the catch block. Let's see the syntax to understand how the exceptions are handled by the TryCatch block. The syntax of the TryCatch block reads like this: try statement set that may cause exception. That is inside a pair of curly braces. Next comes catch block, and here catch block comes with an exception class, exception name. We have discussed different types of exceptions. So these statements in the try block can result into any type of exception. So there should be suitable catch block that can handle the type of exception that may occur in the try block. This is the code that handles that type of exception which is specified in the catch argument. Consider that one of the statements in the try block results into a format exception. So, one of the catch blocks should be written to handle format exception. So, suppose this catch block is written to handle format exception. So, when that exception occurs in the try block, then the program control directly enters into the catch block associated with the format exception, and the error handling code written in that catch will get executed. Then where the control goes? Then the program control directly comes out of the catch block and it enters into the finally block. What for the finally block is used? The finally block gets executed always, whether the try block terminates normally or terminates due to an exception. The main purpose of finally block is to release the system resources, the statements that should be executed irrespective of the exception, if the exception occurs or not occurs. In both the cases, suppose you need to execute some statements. Those statements should be placed inside the finally section. And the finally section is optional also. You may avoid that section completely. It is not mandatory. The finally block is especially useful when you want to release system resources even if an exception occurs. When we talk about system resources, we can just explain it in terms of database programming in C#. If you try to do database programming using a C#, you need to open the database, do the manipulations in the database, and finally you will have to close the database. Consider that you are giving all the statements for opening the database and manipulating the database in the try block. And if any exception in the try block occurs, you're going to deal with that exceptions in the catch blocks. Now, in the finally block, you may be giving the statements to close the database. So it is very necessity that the database should be closed even if an exception occurs or not occurs. So it's good to give the database close statements in the finally section. In the next lecture, we will explain some demo applications to see how the TryCatch finally block works. Thank you guys. That's all in this lecture. We'll see you in the next lecture.